The Invasion of India. By Alexander the Great.
If you are returning to the Classic Masterworks channel, welcome back. If you are new, please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you will be made aware of our latest content. And now, on with the story.
Introduction. The Invasion of India by Alexander the Great, like the first voyage of Columbus to America, was the means of opening up a new world to the knowledge of mankind. Before the great conqueror visited that remote and sequestered country, which was then thought to lie at the utmost ends of the earth, nothing was known regarding it beyond a few vague particulars mentioned by Herodotus, and such grains of truth as could be sifted from the mass of fictions which formed the staple of the treatise on India written by Ctesias of Knidos. A comparison of this work with the Indica of Megasthenes, which was written after the invasion, will show how entirely all real knowledge of the country was due to that event. It may even, we think, be asserted that had that invasion not taken place, the knowledge of India among the nations of the West would not have advanced much beyond where Ctesias left it, until the maritime passage to the east by the Cape of Good Hope had been discovered. It was early in the year 326 BC that Alexander, fresh from the conquest of the fierce tribes of northern Afghanistan, led his army over into the plains of India by a bridge of boats, with which he had spanned the Indus a little below its junction with the Kabul River. He remained in the country not more than 20 months all told, yet in that brief space he reduced the Punjab as far as the Satluj, and the whole of the spacious valley of the lower Indus, downwards to the ocean itself. He would even have penetrated to the Ganges had his army consented to follow him, and, in the opinion of Sandrakotos, would have succeeded in adding to his empire the vast regions through which that river flows. The rapidity with which he achieved his actual conquests in the country appears all the more surprising when we take into account that at every stage of his advance he encountered a most determined resistance. The people were not only of a most martial temperament, but were at the same time inured to arms, and had they but been united and led by such a capable commander as Poros, the Macedonian army was doomed to utter destruction. Alexander, with all his matchless strategy, could not have averted such a catastrophe. For what is the record of his Indian campaigns? We find that the toughest of all his battles was that which he fought on the banks of the Hydaspes against Poros, that he had hot work in overcoming the resistance of the Scythians before the walls of Sangala, that he was wounded near to death in his assault upon the Maulian stronghold, and that in the valley of the Indus he could only overpower the opposition instigated by the Brahmins by means of wholesale massacres and executions. It may hence be safely inferred that if Alexander had found India united in arms to withstand his aggression, the star of his good fortune would have culminated with his passage of the Indus. But he found, on the contrary, the political condition of the country when he entered it eminently favorable to his designs. The regions of the Indus and its great tributary streams were then divided into separate states, some under kingly and others under republican governments, but all alike prevented by their mutual jealousies and feuds from acting in concert against a common enemy, and therefore all the more easy to overcome. Alexander, in pursuance of his usual policy, sought to secure the permanence of his Indian conquests, by founding cities, which he strongly fortified and garrisoned with large bodies of troops to overawe and hold in subjection the tribes in their neighborhood. The system of government also which he established was the same as that which he had provided for his other subject provinces, the civil administration being entrusted to native chiefs, while the executive and military authority was wielded by Macedonian officers. The Asiatic nations in general submissively acquiesced in the new order of things, and after a time found no reason to regret the old order which it had superseded. Under their Hellenic masters they enjoyed a greater measure of freedom than they had ever before known. Commerce was promoted, wealth increased, the administration of justice improved, and altogether they reached a higher level of culture, both intellectual and moral, than they could possibly have attained under a continuance of Persian supremacy. India did not participate to any great extent in these advantages. Her people were too proud and warlike to brook long the burden and reproach of foreign thraldom, and within a few years after the conqueror's death they completely freed themselves from the yoke he imposed, and were thereafter ruled by their native princes. The Greek occupation having thus proved so transient, had little more effect in shaping the future course of the national destinies than a casual raid of Scottish borderers into Cumberland in the old days could have had in shaping the general course of English history. By this disruption of her relations with the rest of Alexander's empire, India fell back into her former isolation from all the outside world, and for more than 15 or 16 centuries afterwards the Western nations knew as little of her internal condition as they knew till lately of the interior of the Dark Continent. The invasion was, however, by no means fruitless of some good results. As has been already indicated, it drew aside the veil which had till then shrouded India from the observation of the rest of the world, and it thus widened the horizon of knowledge. It is fortunate that what then became known of India was not left for its preservation at the mercy of mere oral tradition, but was committed to the safer custody of writing. Not a few of Alexander's officers and companions were men of high attainments in literature and science, and some of their number composed memoirs of his wars, in the course of which they recorded their impressions of India and the races by which they found it inhabited. These reports, even in the fragmentary state in which they have come down to us, have proved of inestimable value to scholars engaged in the investigation of Indian antiquity, a task which the sad deficiency of Sanskrit literature in history and chronology has rendered one of no ordinary difficulty. Strabo, we must however note, stigmatized the authors referred to as being in general a set of liars, of whom only a few managed now and then to stammer out some words of truth. This sweeping censure is, however, a most egregious calumny. It may indeed be admitted that their descriptions are not uniformly free from error or exaggeration, and may even be tainted by some intermixture of fiction, but on the whole they wrote in good faith, a fact which even Strabo himself practically admits by frequently citing their authority for his statements. If one or two of them are to some extent liable to the censure, it must be remembered that Ptolemy, Aristobulus, Nikos, Megasthenes, and others of them, are writers of unimpeachable veracity. It is to be regretted that the works in which these writers recorded their Indian experiences have all, without exception, perished. We know, however, the main substance of their contents from the histories of Alexander, written several centuries after his death by the authors we have here translated, as well as from Strabo, Pliny, Aelianos, Athenaeus, Orosius, and others. The following is a list of the writers on India who visited the country either with Alexander, or not many years after his death, or who were at least his contemporaries. 1. Ptolemy, the son of Lagos, who became king of Egypt. 2. Aristobulus of Potidaea, or, as it was called afterwards, Cassandreia. 3. Nikos, a Cretan by birth, but settled at Amphipolis, admiral of the fleet. 4. One Isikritos of Astapaleia, or, as some say, of Aegina, pilot of the fleet. 5. Eumenes of Cardia, Alexander's secretary, who kept the ephemerides or court journal. His countryman, Hieronymus, in his work on Alexander's successors, made a few references to the campaigns of the conqueror. 6. Chares of Mytilene, wrote anecdotes of Alexander's private life. 7. Callisthenes of Olynthos, Aristotle's kinsman, author of an account of Alexander's Asiatic expedition. 8. Clitarchus, son of Danon of Rhodes, author of a life of Alexander. 9. Androsthenes of Thasos, a naval officer, author of a Periplus. 10. Polykleitos of Larissa, author of a history of Alexander, full of geographical details. 11. Chersilos of Pharsalos, who wrote of the exploits of Alexander. 12. Anaximenes of Lampsacos, author of a history of Alexander. 13. Diognetos, who, with Baton, measured and recorded the distances of Alexander's marches. 14. Archelaus, a geographer, supposed to have accompanied Alexander's expedition. 15. Amyntas, author of a work on Alexander's staphmoi, i.e. stages or halting places. 16. Patroclus, a writer on geography. 17. Megasthenes, friend of Seleucus Nicator, and his ambassador at the court of Sandracotos, king of Palibothra, composed an Indica. 18. Deimachos, ambassador at the same court in the days of the son and successor of Sandracotos, author of a work on India in 2 books. 19. Diodotos of Erythrae, who, like Eumenes, kept Alexander's court journal, and may possibly have been in India. 5 consecutive narratives of Alexander's Indian campaigns, compiled several centuries after his death from the works of the writers enumerated, who were either witnesses of the events they described, or living at the time of their occurrence, have descended to our times, and are respectively contained in the following productions. 1. The Anabasis of Alexander, by Arrian of Nicomedia. 2. The History of Alexander the Great, by Quintus Curtius Rufus. 3. The Life of Alexander, in Plutarch's Parallel Lives. 4. The History of Diodorus the Sicilian. 5. The Book of Macedonian History, compiled from the Universal History of Trogus Pompeius, by Justinus Frontinus. Arrian. Arrian, who is universally allowed to be by far the best of all Alexander's historians, was at once a philosopher, a statesman, a military commander, an expert in the tactics of war, and an accomplished writer. He was born towards the end of the 1st century of our era at Nicomedia, now Ismicnid or Izmid, the capital of Bithynia, situated near the head of a deep bay at the southeastern end of the Propontis or Sea of Marmora. He became a disciple of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, much in the same way as Xenophon attached himself to Socrates, and gave to the world an abstract of his master's lectures, together with an enchiridion or manual of his philosophy, a work which was long and widely popular. Under the Emperor Hadrian he was appointed in AD 132 prefect of Cappadocia. He had not long filled this office when a large body of wild Alan horsemen made one of their formidable raids into his province. They had hitherto proved irresistible, but on this occasion they were completely foiled by the skillful strategy and tactics of Arrian, who expelled them from his borders before they had secured any plunder. In Rome he was preferred to various high offices, and under Antoninus Pius was raised to the consulship. In his later years he retired to his native city, where he occupied himself in composing treatises on a considerable variety of subjects, but chiefly on history and geography. He died at an advanced age in the reign of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. His account of Alexander's Asiatic expedition was followed by a treatise on India called the Indica. The first part of this work, which gives a description of India and its people, was based chiefly on the Indica of Megasthenes, and the second part, which narrates the famous voyage of Nikos from the mouth of the Indus to the head of the Persian Gulf, was based on a journal kept by Nikos himself. The work is but a supplement to his history. He speaks himself with noble pride of this great work. "This I do assert," he says, "that this historical record of Alexander's deeds is, and has been from my youth up, in place to me of native land, family, and honors of state, and so I do not regard myself as unworthy to take rank among the foremost writers in the Greek language, if Alexander be forsooth among the foremost in arms. Quel delia de l'amor propri," here exclaims St. Croix. His merits as an author are thus well stated by a writer in Smith's Classical Dictionary. This great work, the Anabasis, reminds the reader of Xenophon's Anabasis, not only by its title, but also by the ease and clearness of its style. Great as his merits thus are as an historian, they are yet surpassed by his excellences as an historical critic. His Anabasis is based upon the most trustworthy historians among the contemporaries of Alexander. One of the great merits of the work is the clearness and distinctness with which he describes all military movements and operations, the drawing up of the armies for battle, and the conduct of battles and sieges. Q. Curtius Rufus. Nothing is known with any certainty respecting either the life of this historian or the time at which he lived. Niebuhr makes him contemporary with Septimius Severus, but most critics with Vespasian. Zumpt again, who, like some other eminent scholars, identifies him with the rhetorician Q. Curtius Rufus, of whom Suetonius wrote a life now lost, places him as early as Augustus. The style in which his history is written certainly shows him to have been a consummate master of rhetoric. He was particularly given to adorning his narrative with speeches and public harangues, and these, as Zumpt observes, are marked with a degree of power and effectiveness which scarcely anything in that species of writing can surpass. It may also be said that his style for elegance does not fall much short of the perfection of Cicero himself. It has of course its faults, and in these can be traced the incipient degeneracy of the Latin language, such as the introduction of poetical diction into prose, the ambition of expressing everything pointedly and strikingly, not to mention certain deviations from strict grammatical propriety. The materials of his narrative were drawn chiefly from Ptolemy, who accompanied Alexander into India, from Cleitarchus their contemporary, and from Timagenes, who flourished in the reign of Augustus, and wrote an excellent history of Alexander and his successors. While the sources whence he derived his information were thus good on the whole, he was himself deficient in the knowledge of military tactics, geography, chronology, astronomy, and especially in historical criticism, and he is therefore as an historical authority far inferior to Arrian. But in perusing his pictured pages the reader takes but little note of his errors and inconsistencies, being fascinated with his graceful and glowing narrative, interspersed as it is with brilliant orations, sage maxims, sound moral reflections, vivid descriptions of life and manners, and beautiful estimates of character. It is not surprising that with such merits Curtius has been one of the most popular of the classical authors. In spite of all his sins, for which he has so often been pilloried by the censors of literary morals, his history of Alexander has been the delight and admiration of not a few of the greatest of European scholars. He seems to have taken Livy as his model, as Arrian took Xenophon for his. His work consisted originally of 10 books, but the first 2 are lost, and in some of the others considerable gaps occur. The French translation of Curtius by Vaugelas, who devoted 30 years of his life to the task, is so remarkable for its elegance that it has been pronounced to be as inimitable as Alexander himself was invincible. It is not, however, a very close version. Plutarch. There are but few works in the wide circle of literature which have afforded so much instruction and entertainment to the world as Plutarch's parallel lives of the famous men of Greece and Rome. These lives, which are 46 in number, are arranged in pairs, and each pair contains the life of a Greek and a Roman, followed, though not always, by a comparison drawn between the two. Alexander the Great and Caesar are ranked together, but no comparison follows. In his introduction to the life of the former, Plutarch explains his method as a biographer. We do not, he says, give the actions in full detail and with a scrupulous exactness, but rather in a short summary, since we are not writing histories, but lives. It is not always in the most distinguished achievements that men's vices or virtues may be best discerned, but often an action of but little note, a short saying or a jest, may mark a person's real character more than the greatest sieges or the most important battles. His lives, therefore, while useful to the writer of history, must be used with care, since they are not intended as materials for history. His narrative of Alexander's progress through India has 1 or 2 passages which show this indifference to historical accuracy, as when, for instance, he states that the soldiers of Alexander refused to pass the Ganges when they saw the opposite bank covered with the army of the king of the Persians. His account of the battle with Poros is, however, excellent, and all the more interesting, because, as he tells us, he obtained the particulars from Alexander's own letters. Plutarch was a native of Chaironea, a town in Boeotia. The date of his birth is unknown, but may be fixed towards the middle of the 1st century of our era. He visited Italy, and lectured on philosophy in some of its cities. For some time he lived in Rome, where, it is said, but on doubtful authority, that he was promoted to high offices of state, and became tutor to the Emperor Trajan. The later years of his life he spent at Chaironea, where he discharged various magisterial offices and held a priesthood. The date of his death, like that of his birth, is unknown, but it is clear that he lived to an advanced age. Besides the lives, he published other writings, mostly essays, having some resemblance to those of Bacon. They are 60 in number, and are called collectively Morali, though some of them are of an historical character. 2 of them are orations about the fortune or virtue of Alexander. His style is somewhat difficult, at times cumbrous and involved, and somewhat deficient in that grace and perspicuity for which the works of the Attic writers are noted. His writings are all the more valuable from their supplying a deficiency of the Greek historians, whose works are filled with the records of war and politics, while giving us but little insight into men's private lives and their social surroundings. Diodorus the Sicilian. Diodorus was born at Agirium, a city in the interior of Sicily, and was a contemporary of Julius Caesar and the Emperor Augustus. It was the great ambition of his life to write in universal history, and having this in view he traveled over a great part of Europe and Asia in order to acquire a more accurate knowledge of countries and nations than could be obtained from merely reading books. In Rome, where a far greater number of the ancient documents which he required to consult had been collected than were to be found elsewhere, he resided for a considerable time. He spent 30 years in the composition of his work, to which he gave the name of Bibliothèque, which indicated that it formed quite a library in itself, embracing, as it did, the history of all ages and all countries. It consisted of 40 books, which he divided into 3 great sections. First, the mythical period previous to the Trojan War, 2d, the period thence to the death of Alexander the Great, 3d, the period from Alexander to the beginning of Caesar's Gallic Wars. Considerable portions of the Bibliothèque are lost, but all the books relating to the period with which we are concerned are still extant. Diodorus constructed his narrative upon the plan of annals, placing the events of each year side by side without regard to their intrinsic connection. The value of the work is greatly impaired by the author's evident want of critical discernment. He mixes up history with fiction, shows frequently that he has misunderstood his authorities, and advances statements which are mutually contradictory. His style is, however, pleasing, having the merits of simplicity and clearness. In his second book he gives a description of India epitomized from Megasthenes. His account of Alexander's career in India records some interesting particulars of which we should otherwise have remained ignorant. He seems to have drawn largely from the same sources as Curtius. Justinus Frontinus. Justin, in the preface to his work entitled De Historiis Philippicis, informs us that it was a kind of anthology, Voluti Florum Corpusculum, extracted from the 44 volumes published by Pompeius Trogus on Philippic, i.e. Macedonian, history. As these volumes included histories of nearly all the countries with which the Macedonian sovereigns had transactions, they embraced such a very wide field that they were regarded as a cyclopedia of general history. Justin remarks that while many authors regard it as an arduous task to write no more than the history of one king or one state, we cannot but think that Pompeius had the daring of Hercules in attacking the whole world, seeing that in his books are contained the residential gesti of all ages, kings, nations, and peoples. He then states that he had occupied his leisure while in Rome by selecting those passages of Trogus which seemed most worthy of being generally known, and passing over such as he took to be neither particularly interesting nor instructive. He has been much, but unjustly, blamed for his omissions, seeing that his only object in writing was to compile a work of elegant historical extracts. By so doing he has rescued from oblivion many facts not elsewhere recorded. From the extracts relating to India we gather more information about Sandrakotos, Chandragupta, than from any other classical source. Trogus Pompeius belonged, we know, to the age of Augustus, but it is uncertain when Justin lived. As the earliest writer by whom he is mentioned is Saint Jerome, his date cannot be later than the beginning of the 5th century of our era. The life of Alexander the Great. Alexander III, king of Macedonia, surnamed the Great, was born at Pella in the year 356 BC. He was the son of Philip II and Olympias, who belonged to the royal race of Epeiros, which claimed to be descended from Achilles, the hero of the Iliad. The education of the prince was in the outset entrusted to Lysimachos, an Acarnanian, and to his mother's kinsman Leonidas, 16, a man of an austere character, who inured his pupil to Spartan-like habits of hard exercise and simple fare. In his 13th year he was placed under the immediate tuition of Aristotle, who acquired a lifelong influence over the mind and character of his pupil. It may be supposed that the eager love of discovery which conspicuously distinguished Alexander from ordinary conquerors was in a great measure inspired and stimulated by the precepts of his master. In his 16th year he was entrusted, during his father's absence on a foreign expedition, with the regency of Macedonia, and 2 years later, at the Battle of Chaeronea, which was won chiefly through his impetuous valor, he displayed for the first time his incomparable genius for war. This victory made the Macedonian king supreme in Greece, and at a convention which met soon afterwards at his summons, and which was attended by deputies from all the Grecian states except Sparta, he was appointed to command the national forces and to conduct an expedition against Persia to avenge the invasions of Mardonios and Xerxes. He was actively engaged in preparing for this great contest when he fell by the hand of an assassin. Alexander succeeded, 336 BC, not only to his sovereignty, but also to his supremacy in the affairs of Greece. He found himself, immediately on his accession, beset on all sides with most formidable opponents. Attilos, who was in Asia with a considerable force under his command, aspired to the throne. The Greeks, instigated by the passionate eloquence of Demosthenes, attempted to liberate, 17, themselves from Macedonian dictation, and the barbarians of the north threatened his hereditary dominions with invasion. The youthful monarch was equal to the emergency. He at once seized Attilos and put him to death. Then suddenly marching southwards, he suppressed by skillful diplomacy the incipient rebellion of the Greek states. In the next place he turned his arms northwards, and, after much severe fighting, subjugated the barbarous tribes which lay between the frontiers of his kingdom and the Danube. Finally, he quelled in blood and desolation the revolt of Thebes, which had been prompted by a false rumor of his death. Having thus in a single year made himself a more powerful monarch than his father had ever been, he directed all his energies to complete the arrangements for the Persian expedition. The whole force which he collected for this purpose amounted to little more than 30,000 foot and 4,500 horse. The empire which this comparatively insignificant force was destined to attack and overthrow was the greatest which the world had as yet seen, and had already subsisted for 200 years. It had been founded by Cyrus the Great, and extended by his successors till it embraced all Asia from the shores of the Aegean and the Levant to the regions of the Jaxartes and the Indus. It was divided by the great belt of desert, which stretches almost continuously from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Aral, into two great sections which differed widely both in their physical aspect and the character of their inhabitants. The eastern tribes living amid mountains and deserts were rude, but distinguished for their hardihood, their love of independence, and their martial prowess. The Western Asiatics, on the other hand, who inhabited those fair and fertile countries which had been the earliest seats of civilization, were singularly deficient in these qualities. Enervated by ease and the affluence of luxuries, they offered but a feeble resistance to Alexander, and bent their necks submissively to his yoke. He had quite a different experience when he came into conflict with the tribes of the Oxus, Jaxartes, and Indus. They resisted him with the utmost spirit and determination, rose against him even after defeat, and succeeded in inflicting a signal disaster on his arms. The system by which the vast empire was governed may be described as a rigid monarchy. It was divided by Darius Hystaspes into 20 provinces, a number which was afterwards much augmented probably by the subdivision of the larger ones. The government of each was committed to a satrap whose powers were almost despotic. He collected the revenues, from which, besides defraying the expenses of his own administration, he was obliged to remit a fixed amount of annual tribute to the royal treasury. The Indian satrapy, which probably included Bactria and was limited to the regions west of the Indus, paid the largest tribute, which, as we learn from Herodotus, amounted to the immense sum of 360 talents of gold dust. The king who filled the throne at the time of the invasion was Darius Kodamanos, who had some reputation for personal courage and some other virtues which might have adorned his reign had it been fated to be peaceful. He was, however, like Louis XVI of France, quite destitute of the skill and nerve required for piloting the vessel of the state in stormy times. The empire long before his accession had been falling into decay. Insurrections were forever breaking out. Some of the provinces, though nominally subject, were practically independent, while in others the satraps both claimed and exercised the right of transmitting their authority by hereditary succession. What saved it from dissolution was, not so much the strength of the government, as the reluctance of the leading men, through their distrust of each other's good faith, to enter into combinations against it. It was another symptom of its weakness, that the king in his wars trusted far more to the Greek troops in his pay than to his native levies and their leaders. Neither the Greeks nor the Persians had lost sight of the fact that at Cunaxa the victory had been won for Cyrus by the Greek mercenaries. Alexander, having completed his preparations, and appointed Antipater to act as regent of Macedonia during his absence, crossed over the Hellespont into Asia in the spring of 334 BC. His army, though numerically insignificant when compared with the magnitude of the enterprise which lay before it, proved nevertheless, from the physical superiority, courage, and daring of the men, combined with the perfection of their organization and discipline, and the consummate skill of their leader, more than a match for any force, however numerous, which was brought into the field against it. We may here quote a passage from Thirlwall, in which he describes the composition, organization, and equipment of this heroic little army which performed the greatest deeds recorded in military annals.
The main body, the phalanx, or quadruple phalanx, as it was sometimes called, to mark that it was formed of 4 divisions, each bearing the same name, presented a mass of 18,000 men, which was distributed, at least by Alexander, into 6 brigades of 3,000 each, formidable in its aspect, and on ground suited to its operations, irresistible in its attacks. The phalangite soldier wore the usual defensive armor of the Greek heavy infantry, helmet, breastplate, and greaves, and almost the whole front of his person was covered with the long shield called the aspis. His weapons were a sword long enough to enable a man in the second rank to reach an enemy who had come to close quarters with a comrade who stood before him, and the celebrated spear, known by the Macedonian name, sarissa, 24 feet long. The sarissa, when couched, projected 18 feet in front of the soldier, and the space between the ranks was such that those of the second rank were 15, those of the third 12, those of the fourth 9, those of the fifth 6, and those of the sixth 3 feet in advance of the first line, so that the man at the head of the file was guarded on each side by the points of 6 spears. The ordinary depth of the phalanx was of 16 ranks. The men who stood too far behind to use their sarissas, and who therefore kept them raised until they advanced to fill a vacant place, still added to the pressure of the mass. As the efficacy of the phalanx depended on its compactness, and this again on the uniformity of its movements, the greatest care was taken to select the best soldiers for the foremost and hindmost ranks, the frames, as it were, of the engine. The bulk and core of the phalanx consisted of Macedonians, but it was composed in part of foreign troops. These were no doubt Greeks, but the northern Illyrians, Paeonians, Agrianians, and Thracians, who were skilled in the use of missiles, furnished bowmen, dartsmen, and slingers, probably according to the proportion which the master of tactics deemed the most eligible, about half the number of the phalanx. To these was added another class of infantry, peculiar in some respects to the Macedonian army, though the invention belonged to Iphicrates. They were called hypaspists, because, like the phalangites, they carried the long shield, but their spears were shorter, their swords longer, their armor lighter. They were thus prepared for more rapid movements, and did not so much depend on the nature of the ground. They formed a corps of about 6,000 men. The cavalry was similarly distinguished into three classes by its arms, accoutrements, and mode of warfare. Its main strength consisted in 1,500 Macedonian and as many Thessalian horse. But the rider and his horse were cased in armor, and his weapons seem to have corresponded to those of the heavy infantry. The light cavalry, chiefly used for skirmishing and pursuit, and in part armed with the sarissa, was drawn from the Thracians and Paeonians, and was about the third of the number of the heavy horse. A smaller body of Greek cavalry probably stood in nearly the same relation to the other two divisions, as the hypaspists to the heavy and light infantry. To the hypaspists belonged the royal foot bodyguard, the aegma, or royal escort, and the argyraspides, so called from the silver ornaments with which their long shields were enriched. But the precise relation in which these bodies stood to each other does not appear very distinctly from the descriptions of the ancients. The royal horse guard was composed of 8 Macedonian squadrons, filled with the sons of the best families. The numbers of each are not ascertained, but they seem in all not much to have exceeded or fallen short of 1,000.
From this description of the Macedonian army, it may easily be imagined what a formidable aspect its main arm, the phalanx of panoplied infantry, would present to the enemy. Polybius informs us that the Roman officers who were present in the Battle of Kynoskephali, and then saw the phalanx for the first time, told him that in all their experience of war they had never seen anything so terrible. The phalanx, however, as that historian points out, could only operate effectively on level and open ground, was quite unfit for rapid advance and rough terrain, and useless if its ranks were broken. It was thus helpless in face of an active enemy unless well supported by cavalry and light troops. This explains why Alexander attached so much importance to his cavalry. In point of fact, he owed none of his victories to the phalanx. His cavalry, rapid in its evolutions and charging with resistless impetuosity, gained them all. In addition to the troops which have been particularized in the extract, there was one kind organized by Alexander called dimichai, intermediate between cavalry and infantry, being designed to fight on horseback or on foot as circumstances required. His artillery formed a very useful part of his equipment. The ballistae and catapultae of which it consisted threw stones and darts to the distance of 300 yards, and was frequently employed with great effect. As he foresaw that in the course of his expedition he was likely to penetrate to regions either imperfectly or altogether unknown, he entertained on his staff men of literary and scientific requirements to write his deeds, and describe those countries and nations to which he might carry his arms. He first came into conflict with the Persians on the banks of the Granicos, a small river, which, flowing from Mount Ida through the Trojan plain, enters the Propontis to the west of Kyzikos. Their army, which consisted of 20,000 horse, and an equal number of Greek mercenaries, was commanded by several satraps who were assisted by the counsels of Memnon the Rhodian, the ablest general in the service of Darius. The Persians were drawn up in line along the right bank of the stream, while their mercenaries were posted on a range of heights that rose in the rear. Alexander drew up his forces on the opposite bank in the order which he adopted in all his great battles. Thus the phalanx formed his center, he commanded himself the extreme right, and the officer in whom he had most confidence the extreme left. To either wing were attached such brigades of the phalanx as circumstances seemed to require. The Persians, having observed where Alexander was posted, strengthened their left wing with dense squadrons of their best cavalry, anticipating that this part of their line would be exposed to the first fury of the onset led by himself in person. They judged aright. Alexander, having sent a detachment of cavalry across the stream, followed with other cavalry and a portion of the phalanx. The Persians made a gallant resistance, but were soon beaten. Their darts and scimitars were no match for the tough cornel of the Macedonian spears. Their ranks first broke where Alexander himself in the hottest of the fight was dealing death and wounds around him. A blow which was descending on his own head, and which if delivered would have proved fatal, was intercepted by Cleitos, who cut off the arm of the assailant, scimitar and all. The field was won before either the phalanx on the one side, or the Greek mercenaries on the other, could come into action. The Macedonians, after returning from a short pursuit, closed around the mercenaries and cut them down, all but 2,000 who were made prisoners and sent in chains to Macedonia. The number of the Persians slain was about 1,000 against only 115 on the other side. Alexander did not, like most other conquerors after a victory, plunder the surrounding country, but regarding Asia as already his own, treated the inhabitants as subjects whose interests he was bound to protect and promote. Neither did he at once advance into the interior, but, acting by a rule of strategy which he was always careful to observe, resolved to make his rear secure. He therefore first reduced all the western provinces of the empire which Darius after the defeat of his satraps had placed under the supreme authority of Memnon the Rhodian. Memnon was a formidable antagonist, both from his skill in war, and from his having a powerful fleet at his command, which gave him the dominion of the sea, and enabled him to threaten at will the shores of Greece and Macedonia. Alexander marched from the battlefield to Ilion, and advanced thence southward through the beautiful regions of Ionia and the other maritime states, which, in striking contrast to their present blighted condition, were then at the height of prosperity, adorned with numerous rich and splendid cities, which vied with each other in all the arts of refinement. The terror of his name preceded him, and these cities one after another, including even Sardis, the western capital, which was strongly fortified, threw open their gates to admit him. Miletos, however, and Halicarnassos, being supported by the Persian fleet, refused to surrender, and did not fall into his hands until each had been for some time besieged. After the fall of Halicarnassos, the rest of Korea, of which it was the capital, submitted, and then the operations of the first year of the war were brought to a close by the reduction of all Lycia. In this province he gave his army some rest. The next campaign opened with the conquest of Pamphylia, after which Alexander turned his march away from the coast with a view to invade Phrygia, which lay to the north beyond the lofty range of Tauros. It was now the depth of winter, but Alexander, in defiance of all obstacles, frost and snow, torrents and precipices, and the resistance of the fierce Pisidian mountaineers, forced his way into the Phrygian plains. This passage of the Tauros at such a season was an achievement not unworthy to rank with the more celebrated passage of the Alps made by Hannibal about a century later. After he had cleared the defiles, a march of 5 days brought him to Calainae, the capital of the Greater Phrygia, which was pleasantly situated where the river Marsyas joins the Maeander, and was embellished with a palace and a royal park. Alexander, deeming its acropolis to be impregnable, made terms with the inhabitants, and then advanced to the ancient capital called Gordion, after Gordios, the father of the celebrated Midas, the first king of the country. Here was the complicated knot to which the prophecy was attached that whoever untied it should be lord of Asia. It was tied on a rope of bark which fastened the yoke to the pole of the wagon on which Midas had been carried into the city on the day when the people chose him as their king. Alexander either undid the knot or cut it through with his sword. On the return of spring he moved forward to Ancyra, now Angora, and there had the satisfaction to receive the submission of the Paphlagonians, who at that time were a very powerful nation. Being thus free to move southwards without leaving an enemy in his rear, he entered Cappadocia, and having overrun it without encountering any serious opposition, he recrossed the Tauros by a pass that admitted him into the fertile plains of eastern Cilicia. The capital of this province was Tarsos, a flourishing seat of commerce, art, and learning, built on both banks of the river Kidnos, which was navigable to the sea. This important city fell without resistance into Alexander's hands, the satrap having fled at the tidings of his approach. Here, however, he nearly lost his life, having caught a violent fever by throwing himself when heated into the waters of the Kidnos, which ran cold with the snows of Mount Tauros. After his recovery he sent Parmenion eastward to occupy the passes leading into Syria, called the Syrian Gates, and marched himself in the opposite direction to reduce the hill tribes of western Cilicia. In the meantime Darius, advancing from the east, had crossed the Euphrates and the Syrian desert at the head of an army not less numerous than that with which Napoleon invaded Russia, and was lying encamped on a wide plain suitable for his cavalry within a 2 days' march of the Syrian Gates. Here he waited for some time ready to fall upon the Macedonian troops and crush them with the overwhelming superiority of his numbers when they debouched from the defile. When he despaired of their coming, he marched into Cilicia through a pass known as the Amanian Gates and encamped on the banks of the Pineros which flows through the plain of Issos to the sea. He thus placed himself in a trap where he was hemmed in by the mountains and the sea in a narrow plain not more than 1.5 miles in width. Alexander meanwhile had passed through the other gates into the Syrian plain when he learned to his astonishment that Darius was now in his rear. He at once retraced his steps, and by midnight regained the pass, where from one of its summits he beheld the Persian watchfires gleaming far and wide over the plain of Issos. At daybreak he marched down the pass, and on reaching the open part of the plain made the usual disposition of his forces, Parmenion commanding the left, and himself the right wing. Darius had drawn up his line, which extended from the mountains to the sea, along the northern bank of the river Pineros. In the center, which confronted the dreaded Macedonian phalanx, he had posted a body of 30,000 heavy-armed Greek mercenaries. Alexander began the action by dislodging a detachment of the enemy which had been posted at the base of the mountains and threatened his rear. Finding the Persians did not advance, he crossed the river and charged their left wing with such impetuosity that he broke their ranks and swept them from the field irretrievably discomfited. He then wheeled round and brought timely succor to his phalanx, which the Greek mercenaries of Darius were driving back with disordered ranks to the river. The struggle now became desperate, for these mercenaries, bitterly resenting the state of political degradation to which the Macedonians had reduced their compatriots in southern Greece, now fought against them with all the fury that the passions of hate and rivalry could inspire. They were nevertheless driven back, and the tide of battle surged up towards the state chariot itself, on which Darius was mounted in the center of his line. The pusillanimous monarch no sooner perceived that his person was in danger than he ordered his charioteer to turn the heads of his horses for flight. This decided the fortunes of the day. It was the signal of his defeat, and his troops, on seeing it, at once broke from their ranks and fled from the field. The cavalry even, which on the extreme right had victory almost within their grasp, yielded to the general panic, and helped to swell the crowd of fugitives. As the narrowness of the plain allowed but very little room for escape, the vanquished were massacred in myriads. Darius escaped across the Euphrates, but his treasures and his family, consisting of his mother, wife, and children, fell into Alexander's hands, who treated these illustrious captives with all the kindness and courtesy which were due alike to their misfortunes and their exalted rank. He did not pursue Darius, and about 2 years passed away before he again met him in battle. His victory had left Syria and Egypt open to his arms, and these countries had to be reduced and the power of Persia effectually crushed at sea before he could advance with safety into the heart of the empire. He therefore marched southward to Phoenicia, the seaports of which supplied the Persians with most of their war galleys. Parmenion he sent forward with a small detachment to seize Damascus, where Darius, before his defeat, had deposited his treasures. The city surrendered without resistance, and a vast and varied spoil fell into the hands of the Macedonians. The cities along the Syrian coast submitted in like manner to Alexander himself, all but Tyre, which sent him a golden crown, but refused to admit him within her gates. For this temerity the city of merchant princes paid a dreadful penalty. Alexander, having captured it after a 7-month siege, burned it to the ground, and most of the inhabitants he either slew or sold into slavery. This is considered to have been the greatest of all Alexander's military achievements. Tyre had hitherto been deemed impregnable. It was built on an island separated from the mainland by a channel of the sea 1/2 mile in width. Its walls, which were of great solidity, rose to an immense height, and its navy gave it the command of the sea. The inhabitants, moreover, were expert in arms, and defended themselves with such spirit and obstinacy that Alexander found himself unable to overcome their resistance, until he obtained from Cyprus and Sidon a fleet superior to their own. He had also to construct a causeway through the channel to enable him to bring his engines close up to the walls, and this was a work of vast labor and difficulty. His merciless treatment of the vanquished darkly overshadows the glory of this memorable exploit. Palestine, with the adjoining districts, next submitted to the conqueror. Gaza alone, like Tyre, closed its gates against him. This city, which stood not far from the sea, towards the edge of the desert which separates Syria from Egypt, was strongly fortified, and held out for 2 months. Alexander took it by storm, slaughtered the garrison, and then set out for Egypt. A 7 days' march through the desert brought him to Pelusium. The Egyptians, who smarted under the bondage of Persia, like the Israelites of old under their own, hailed his advent as that of a deliverer, and gladly submitted to his rule. Alexander proceeded as far southward as Memphis and the pyramids, and then embarking on the western or canopic branch of the Nile, sailed down to Lake Mareotis, and landed on the narrow sandy isthmus by which that lake is separated from the sea. This neck of land was faced on the north by the island of Pharos, a long ridge of rock which sheltered it from all the violence of the ocean. Alexander, discerning with his keen eye all the advantages of such a position for commerce, at once founded on the isthmus the city of Alexandria, which, as he anticipated, soon became the great center of trade between the eastern and western worlds. His next object was to consult the oracle of Jupiter Ammon, which was said to have been visited by Heracles and Perseus, from both of whom he claimed to be descended. He therefore marched along the coast for about 200 miles to Paraetonion, which lay at the western extremity of Egypt. On the way he was met by deputies from Kyrene, who brought him valuable presents, and invited him to visit their city. From Paraetonion he marched southward through the Libyan desert, and, after some days, reached the large and beautiful oasis where, embosomed amid thick woods, rose the temple of Ammon and the palace of his priests. On consulting the oracle he obtained answers, about the nature of which he stated nothing further than that they were satisfactory. He then returned across the desert to Memphis, where he settled the future government of Egypt, and ordered justice to be dispensed according to the ancient laws of the country. From Memphis he directed his march to Syria, and on reaching Tyre, remained there for some time. While he was in Egypt he had been visited by Hegalochos, his admiral, who reported that the Persians had been dispossessed of the islands which they had acquired in the Aegean, that their fleet had been dissipated, and that all their leaders were prisoners except Pharnabazos, the successor of Memnon, who had died somewhat suddenly while Alexander was in Phrygia. Alexander was now, therefore, the undisputed master of all the countries west of the Euphrates, and could with complete security turn his arms eastward to bring his contest with Persia to a final issue. Darius, on the other hand, who, in the interval between his defeat and the fall of Tyre, had twice sent an embassy to the conqueror to sue for peace and the ransom of his family, on terms which, though most tempting, had been haughtily refused, was mustering all his forces to encounter the storm of war which would sooner or later burst from the clouds that hung ominously on his western horizon. The army he now raised was far stronger numerically than that with which he had fought at Issos, and, as it was drawn chiefly from the east, consisted of the best troops in his empire. He led it from Babylon across the Tigris, and marching northward along the eastern bank of that river, reached the plains of northern Assyria, which afforded ample space for the evolutions of his numerous cavalry. Here he encamped on a wide plain between the Tigris and the mountains of Kurdistan, near a village called Gaugamela. Alexander, having remained at Tyre until his preparations were completed, started from that city after midsummer in the year 331 BC. On crossing the Euphrates at the fords of Thapsacos, he learned where Darius was, and at once accelerated his march to find him. He passed the Tigris, which had been left unguarded, and advancing southward for a few days, came in sight of the Persian host, which he found already drawn up in line prepared for action. It is said that Parmenion, alarmed by the immense array of the hostile ranks, came at a late hour to the king's tent and proposed a night attack, and that Alexander's answer was that it would be a base thing to steal a victory. His forces amounted only to 40,000 infantry and 7,000 horse, yet he was so confident of success that on the morning of the decisive day his sleep was deeper and longer than usual. In its main features, the battle that followed was but a repetition of the day of Issos. Alexander again commanded the right wing and Parmenion the left. Again Darius posted himself in the center of his line, and again the Greek mercenaries confronted the Macedonian phalanx. Again Alexander, at the head of the companion cavalry, made havoc of the troops which guarded the royal standard, and again Darius, terror-struck at his near approach, ignominiously fled from the field. His flight gave once more the signal of defeat, and that too, as at Issos, just at the time when his cavalry on the right had made the position of Parmenion most critical. Alexander was recalled from the pursuit of Darius, whom he was eagerly bent on capturing, by a messenger sent by Parmenion pressing for instant aid. He at once turned back. On his way he met the Persian and Parthian cavalry and the Indian troops now in full retreat. A combat close and hot followed. The fugitives were for the most part killed, but sold their lives dearly. On returning to the field Alexander found that his left wing was no longer in distress, but putting the enemy to rout, and he therefore started once more in pursuit of Darius. The fugitive escaped, however, to Ecbatana, the capital in former days of the Median kings. Accounts differ as to the numbers that were killed in this battle. Arrian says, absurdly enough, that 300,000 of the Persians were slain, and a greater number taken prisoners. Diodorus reduces the amount to 90,000, and Curtius to 40,000. The loss again on Alexander's side is reckoned by Arrian at 100, by Curtius at 300, and by Diodorus at 500. Alexander pursued the fugitive troops as far as Arbela, the place which has given its name to the battle, though it was 60 miles distant from the field whereon it was fought. Here he found the baggage of Darius, and having enriched himself with its spoils, he advanced southward to Babylon. This great capital, which once gave law to all the nations of the East, had under the rule of the Achaemenids gradually declined both in wealth and importance. Its inhabitants, like the Egyptians, detested their Persian masters, who oppressed them and persecuted their religion. They issued therefore from their gates in a joyful procession to welcome the victor and present him with gifts. His first acts on entering the city were well calculated to make a favorable impression on their minds. He ordered the temple of Belus to be rebuilt, honored that deity with a public sacrifice according to the Chaldean ritual, and restored to his priests the immense revenues with which they had been endowed by the Assyrian kings. Alexander thus found himself the master of a more spacious empire than any the world had yet seen. No king or conqueror had ever before stood on such a giddy pinnacle of power. As he had made his way to this supreme height before he had yet reached those years or experienced those vicissitudes of fortune which have a sobering effect on the mind, it is not surprising that, as in the case of Napoleon, whose genius was at many points in close touch with his own, and who, at a like early age, had amazed the world with his deeds of arms, unbounded success tended to deteriorate his character. He is found henceforth becoming more arrogant and despotic, more suspicious, and avid of flattery, while less tolerant of advice or remonstrance, and less capable of controlling the violence of his passions. The simple style of living in which he had been brought up seemed no longer to please him, and he began to assume all the pomp and splendor with which an Oriental despot loves to surround himself, an innovation in his habits which deeply mortified the pride of the Macedonians. It may be urged in his defense that he may have made the change less from any real inclination than from the politic motive of conciliating his new subjects by conforming to their tastes and habits. Before leaving Babylon he settled the affairs of Assyria and its dependencies in accordance with a principle on which he generally acted, committing the civil administration to a native ruler, but leaving the command of the forces and the collection of the revenue in the hands of Macedonian officers. He then marched eastward, and in 20 days reached Susa, the favorite capital of the Persian kings. Rich as Babylon was, its treasures were as nothing compared with those which had been here accumulated. The sums contained in the treasury amounted to 40,000 talents of uncoined gold and silver, and 9,000 talents of coined gold, and there was other booty besides of immense value, including the spoils which Xerxes had carried off from Greece, the recovery of which gratified beyond measure the patriotic feelings of the army. From Susa Alexander took the road to Persepolis, the ancient capital of the Persians, a rich and splendid city lying to the southeast of Susa, in the beautiful vale of Persis which was fertilized by the streams descending from Mount Zagros, the Meadows, and the Araxes. On his route he passed through the hill country of the Euxins, which like that of the Pisidians, was occupied by warlike and predatory tribes. These mountaineers were nominally subject to Persia, but they nevertheless at one of their defiles exacted toll even from the great king himself whenever he passed through their country in going between his two capitals. They beset this defile with the whole of their effective force to levy the customary tribute from Alexander, who paid them what he called their dues in the form of a crushing defeat. He then plundered their villages, and, having received their submission, pressed forward by way of the formidable pass called the Persian Gates. Here the satrap Ariobarzanes, at the head of more than 40,000 men, tried but in vain to arrest his progress. Alexander, with his usual skill and courage forced the position, and meeting with no further resistance reached Persepolis, where no defense was attempted. He not only permitted his soldiers to plunder this ancient capital, but, if we may believe the story, with which Dryden's ode has made us familiar, set fire with his own hands in a drunken revel to the royal palace, a structure of supreme magnificence, as its ruins, which are still to be seen, attest. It is more probable, however, that he burned it from motives of policy, partly to show the Persians how absolutely he was now their master, and partly to avenge Greece for the destruction of her temples by Xerxes. In the royal treasury he found the vast sum of 120,000 talents, which falls little short of £30 million of our money. As it was now midwinter, he here gave his army some respite from their toils. He gave himself, however, no rest, but led a detachment to Pasargadae, the primitive seat of the Achaemenids, which contained an august monument, the tomb of Cyrus, which still exists, and a rich treasury which he plundered. He next assailed the Mardians, and marching over ice and snow, reduced their mountain fastnesses and compelled their submission. In the spring of 330 BC he resumed the pursuit of Darius, who was still at Ecbatana making vain efforts to raise another army. The fallen monarch, on hearing that the enemy was again moving against him and had reached Media, fled eastward hoping to find protection and safety in the far remote province of Bactria, of which his kinsman Bessos was the satrap. The capital which he had left was the summer residence of the Persian kings, and was noted for the enormous strength of its citadel. Alexander therefore ordered Parmenion to transport thither, as to a place of peculiar security, the treasures which had been seized at the other capitals, and to confide their custody to a strong guard of Macedonian soldiers. This done, he set out with a light detachment of troops in the hope of overtaking the fugitive king before he passed through the Caspian gates. At Ragai, which was a day's rapid march from that pass, he learned that Darius had escaped beyond it, and he therefore halted for 5 days to recruit his troops. On renewing the pursuit and reaching the open country beyond the gates, he learned that the Persian officers who were escorting their sovereign had conspired against him and deprived him of his liberty. Greatly fearing now lest the traitors had some deadlier purpose in view, he made incredible exertions to overtake them, and he came up with them on the 4th day, but all too late. The conspirators, among whom was Bessos, finding that the pursuit was gaining upon them, mortally wounded the hapless king, who breathed his last before Alexander reached him. Such, says Arrian, was the end of Darius, who as a warrior was singularly remiss and injudicious. In other respects his character is blameless, either because he was just by nature, or because he had no opportunity of displaying the contrary, as his accession and the Macedonian invasion were simultaneous. It was not in his power, therefore, to oppress his subjects, as his danger was greater than theirs. His reign was one unbroken series of disasters, and he was at last treacherously assassinated by his most intimate connections. At his death he was about 50 years old. Alexander sent his body into Persia with orders that it should be buried with all due honors in the royal sepulchre. Bessos escaped into his own satrapy where he assumed the upright tiara, the distinguishing emblem of Persian royalty, and took the name of Artaxerxes. Alexander now halted at Hecatompolis, a place which received this Greek name from its being the center where many roads met, and which became in after times the capital of the Parthian kings. Being joined here by the rest of his army, he prepared to invade Hyrcania, from which he was separated by the chain of mountains now called the Elbows. As the passes were beset by robber tribes, he divided his army into 3 bodies. The most numerous division crossed the mountains under his own command by the shortest and most difficult roads. Crateros made a circuit to the left through the country of the Tapirians, Taburistan, while the 3rd division under Erigaios took the royal road which led westward from Hecatompolis to Zadrakata. The divisions on emerging from the defiles united, and encamped near the last named place, which was the Hyrcanian capital. Hither came to Alexander with 3 of his sons the aged Artabasos, accompanied by the Tapirian satrap and by deputies from the Greek mercenaries of Darius. Artabasos was received with distinguished honor, both because of his high rank and the fidelity he had shown to Darius, whom he had accompanied in his flight. The satrap was confirmed in his government, but the deputies were sternly told that as the mercenaries had violated the duty which they owed to their country, they must submit themselves unreservedly to the judgment of the king. Alexander then attacked the Mardians who inhabited the lofty mountains to the northwest of the Caspian gates. They submitted after a slight resistance, and were ordered to obey the Tapirian satrap. Alexander's next object was to crush Bessos and possess himself of all the eastern provinces as far as the borders of India. He therefore marched eastward towards Bactria, and having traversed the northern part of Parthia, reached Susa, a city of Aria, now Suse, near Mesht, the present capital of Khorasan. Satybarzanes, the satrap of that province, and one of the conspirators against Darius, met him here, and having tendered his submission, was confirmed in his government, and dismissed with an escort of Macedonian horsemen to his capital, Artacoana. Alexander then resumed his march towards Bactria, but was arrested on the way by receiving word that Satybarzanes had revolted in favor of Bessos, armed the Arians, and slain his Macedonian escort. He therefore at once altered his route, and by the promptitude of his appearance confounded the plans of the satrap, who fled and was deserted by most of his troops. Artacoana was captured by Crateros after a short siege. This city stood in a plain of exceptional fertility at a point where all the roads from the north to the south, and from the west to the east, united, and Alexander, discerning the incomparable advantages of its position, whether for war or commerce, founded in its neighborhood a new city in which he planted a Macedonian colony. He called it Alexandria, and as it still exists as Herat, it will be seen how well-grounded was its founder's belief in the strategical and commercial importance of its site. Alexander, after suppressing this revolt, instead of resuming his march to Bactria, moved forward to Prophthasia, now Fera, the capital of Drangiana, Syston, of which Barsaentes, another of the accomplices in the murder of Darius, was satrap. This traitor was seized and executed. Here an event occurred which has left a dark stain on the character of Alexander. He was led to suspect that a conspiracy had been formed against his life by some of his principal officers, and among others by the son of Parmenion, Philotas, who held the most coveted post in the army, that of commander of the companion cavalry. It is certain that he was not an accomplice in the plot, but as he had been informed of its existence, and failed to give the king any warning of his danger, he was accused before the Macedonian army and condemned to death. He confessed under torture that his father, Parmenion, had formed a design against the king's life, and that he had himself joined the recent plot, lest his father, who was now an old man, might, before the plot was ripe, be snatched away by death from his command at Ecbatana, which placed the vast treasures deposited there at his disposal. This confession, wrung by torture when its agonies became insupportable, and obviously framed to meet the wishes of the questioners, was no proof of the guilt either of the father or the son. Parmenion was, nevertheless, on this worthless evidence condemned to death, and Alexander, whom he had so faithfully served, took care that the sentence should be executed before the news of his son's death, which he might seek to avenge, could reach his ears. Many other Macedonians were also at this time tried and put to death. Alexander's confidence in his friends was thus much shaken, and instead of entrusting as formerly the command of the companion cavalry to one individual, he divided that body into 2 regiments, giving the command of one to Cleitos, and of the other to Hephaestion. From Prophthasia he proceeded southwards into the fertile plains along the Etemonda, Helmund, then inhabited by a peaceful tribe called the Ariaspians, who had received from Cyrus the title of euagetai, that is, benefactors, because they had assisted him at a time when he had been reduced to great straits. Alexander spent 2 months in their dominions, probably awaiting the arrival of reinforcements from Ecbatana. During this interval Demetrios, a member of the king's bodyguard, was arrested on suspicion of his having been implicated with Philotas in the recent plot, and his office was bestowed on Ptolemy, the son of Lagos, for whom this promotion opened the way to a royal destiny. Alexander before resuming his march appointed a governor over the euagetai, but rewarded their hospitality by augmenting their territory and confirming them in the enjoyment of their political privileges. He left this country about midwinter, and ascending the valley of the Etemonda penetrated into Arachosia, a province which stretched eastward to the Indus. As he advanced northward by Kandahar the snow lay deep on the ground, and the soldiers suffered severely both from hunger and cold. About this time he heard that the Aryans had again revolted at the instigation of Satybazanes, who had entered their province at the head of 2,000 horse, and he immediately sent a detachment under Erigaios to quell the insurgents. Continuing meanwhile his own advance, he arrived at the foot of the colossal mountain barrier, the chain of Paropanisos, which separates Kabul from Bactria. Here in a commanding position, near the village of Charikar, which stands in the rich and beautiful valley of Kodaman, he founded yet another Alexandria, called by way of distinction Alexandria of the Paropamisidai, or Alexandria apud Caucasum, and planted it with Macedonian colonists. According to Strabo he wintered in this neighborhood, but Arrian leads us to suppose that he departed as soon as he had founded the city. He crossed the mountains, as some think, by the Bamian Pass, the most western of the 4 routes which give access from the Kodaman to the regions of the Upper Oxus. It is likelier, however, that he ascended by the more direct route along the course of the Panja River. The army again suffered on the way from the severity of the cold, and still more from the scarcity of provisions. According to Aristobulus nothing grew on these hills but terebinth trees and the herb called silphium, on which the flocks and herds of the mountaineers pastured. This march, which terminated at Adrapsa, occupied 15 days. The Macedonians had now reached a fertile country, but as Bessos had ordered it to be ravaged, they found a wide barrier of desolation opposed to their further advance. The barrier was interposed in vain. Alexander resolutely pressed forward, and Bessos and his associates fled at his approach, and, crossing the Oxus, retired into Sogdiana. Aornos and Bactra, the two principal cities of the Bactrian satrapy, surrendered without resistance, and the satrapy itself was soon afterwards reduced. At Bactra, Erigaios, who had succeeded in quelling the Aeaean revolt, rejoined the army. Alexander, having appointed Artabasos satrap of his new conquest, marched to the Oxus in pursuit of Bessos, and came upon that river at the point where Kegel now stands. There it was about 3/4 of a mile in breadth, and the current was found to be both deep and rapid. The passage, which occupied 5 days, was made on floats, supported by skins stuffed with straw, and rendered watertight. The army had no sooner gained the right bank than messengers arrived from two of the leading adherents of Bessos, Spitamenes, the satrap of Sogdiana, and Dataphones, promising to surrender Bessos, who was already their prisoner, if Alexander would send a small force to their support. The king assented, and sent Ptolemy forward to receive the traitor from their hands. They gave him up, and he was conducted with a rope round his neck into the presence of the king, who ordered him to be scourged and then conveyed to Zariaspa, which some identify with Bactra, there to await his final doom. The army next marched forward to Maracanda, now Samarkand, then merely the capital of the Sogdian satrapy, but destined to be in aftertimes the capital of the vast empire founded by Timur. It stood in the valley of the Polytimetus, Arkohik, a region of such exuberant fertility and beauty that it figures in Persian poetry as one of the 4 paradises of the world. Alexander remained for some time in this pleasant neighborhood to remount his cavalry and otherwise recruit his forces. He then advanced to the river Jaxartes, which formed the boundary between the Persian Empire and the barbarous Scythian tribes, and which the Greeks confounded with the Tanais or Don. The country was protected against the inroads of these warlike tribes by a line of fortified towns, of which the largest and strongest, Syropolis, had been founded, as its name imports, by Cyrus. Alexander captured all these fortresses and manned them with small Macedonian garrisons, and to curb the Scythians still more effectually, founded on the banks of the Jaxartes, near where Cogent now stands, still another Alexandria, which the Greeks for distinction's sake called Aschate, or the Extreme. In the midst of this undertaking, he was interrupted by the sudden outbreak of a widespread rebellion instigated by Spitamenes and his confederates. Taking immediate and energetic steps for its suppression, he in a few days recovered the 7 towns, and then crossing the Jaxartes, defeated the Scythians, who with a view to aid the insurgents had mustered in great force on its right bank. After this victory he received tidings of the first serious disaster that had befallen his arms. He had sent a large force to operate against Spitamenes, who was at the time besieging the Macedonian garrison which held Maracanda. On learning that this force was approaching, the rebel chief retired down the Polytimetus to Bokhara, and thence to the vast desert which stretches from Sog to the Sea of Aral. Here he was joined by a large body of Scythian horsemen, and thus reinforced turned upon his pursuers, drove them back from the edge of the desert, which they had just entered, into the valley whence they had emerged, and there, amid the woody ravines of the Polytimetus, cut them to pieces almost to a man. Encouraged by this success, he returned to Maracanda and renewed the siege of its citadel, but on learning that Alexander was rapidly returning from the Jaxartes, he retraced his steps towards the desert, and reached it before the enemy overtook him. The course of the pursuit led Alexander to the scene of the late disaster. His first care was to bury the slain, and he then avenged their death by ravaging with fire and sword, in all its length and breadth, the lovely valley of the Polytimetus. He showed no mercy, but slaughtered all who fell into his hands, soldier and citizen alike. This is certainly, as Thirlwall remarks, one of the acts of his life for which it is most difficult to find an excuse. As the year, 329 BC, was now drawing to a close, he recrossed the Oxus and returned to Zariaspa, Bactra, where he spent the winter. Sentence was here pronounced upon Bessos, who was mutilated and then sent to Ecbatana for execution. Alexander's European forces, as the narrative has shown, were constantly undergoing diminution, not only by losses in the field, but also by his leaving Macedonian veterans to garrison important strongholds, or to form the nucleus of the population of the cities he founded. He therefore from time to time sent requisitions for recruits to Macedonia and Greece, and as these were adequately met, the fighting quality of his troops was always maintained at the same high level. During his stay at Bactria, a great number of such recruits arrived, and filled up the large gap which the late disaster had made in his ranks. There came thither also ambassadors from the king of the Scythians, bringing presents and the offer of a marriage alliance, which was declined. The king of the Chorasmians, moreover, whose dominions, according to his own account, bordered on the land of the Colchians and the Amazons, came in person and offered his services to Alexander should he wish to subdue the nations to the north and west of the Caspian Sea. Alexander, however, being now anxious to enter India, declined his offers for the present. The accounts of his next two campaigns are confused, and not always mutually consistent. According to Curtius, when he moved from Zariaspa, he crossed the river Okhos, now the Aksu, and came to a city called Marginia, probably the Marginan of our times. Arrian, however, makes no mention of this expedition. The Bactrians were still imperfectly subjugated, and the Sogdians, notwithstanding the severe chastisement they had received, were again up in arms against his authority. He therefore left Crateros to deal with the former, while he marched in person against Maracanda. On his way thither he performed another of his marvelous achievements, the capture of a fortress perched on the summit of a steep, lofty, and strongly fortified rock, held by a powerful garrison, and deemed to be impregnable. He captured it, nevertheless. Within this stronghold Arxiates, a Bactrian chief, had for safety deposited his wife and daughters. Roxana, the eldest daughter, was, next to the wife of Darius, the most beautiful of all Asiatic women, and Alexander was so captivated with her charms that he did not hesitate to make her his wife. Spitamenes, meanwhile, assisted by the Macedonia, one of the Scythian tribes that ranged over the Chorasmian desert, made a devastating eruption into Bactria, and though he was in the end repulsed by Crateros, escaped into the desert beyond the reach of pursuit. Fearing he might renew his attack in some other quarter, Alexander hastened to Maracanda to settle the province and provide for its security against future hostile incursions. To this end he directed a number of new towns to be founded and planted with Macedonian, Greek, and native colonists. In the course of this expedition he came to the royal park at Bazaria, perhaps Bokhara, and while hunting within its precincts killed a lion of extraordinary size with his own hand. On his return to Maracanda a tragic incident occurred, his murder of Cleitos, from whom he had received some provocation in the course of a drunken revel. As he was tenderly attached to Cleitos, who was the brother of his nurse, and had saved his life at the Granicos, his remorse for this frenzied deed knew no bounds at the time, and gave him many bitter moments in his afterlife. His next expedition led him towards the western frontier of the province, where he reduced the district called Zanipa, which lay on the skirts of the Nura Mountains, a range that runs from east to west about 10 miles north of Bokhara. As Spitamenes was supposed to be in the desert not far off, he left Koinos in that part of the country with orders to capture that audacious rebel, while he himself withdrew to Nautica, where he intended to pass the winter. This place was situated in a fertile oasis between Samarkand and the Oxus, and must have occupied the site of Kershi or Kesh, noted afterwards as the birthplace of Timour. Spitamenes, meanwhile, attacked Koinos, but was defeated after a severe struggle, and driven back into the desert. His Scythian confederates, fearing their own country might be invaded, cut off his head and sent it to Alexander, and so perished the most active, bold, and persevering antagonist that he had as yet encountered in Asia, one of the few who resolutely and to the last scorned to bend his neck to a foreign yoke. With the first return of spring, BC 327, he moved from his winter quarters to invade the Pararatakai, who, as their name indicates, inhabited a mountainous district, and were, some think, a branch of the widespread Taka tribe, the name of which appears in Taxila, which designated a great capital it possessed in India. In the country of the Pararatakai, which lay to the east of Bactria and Sogdiana, there was another great rock fortress, which, like the Sogdian, was deemed impregnable. It was the main stronghold of a chief called Corines, who, after holding out for some time, was persuaded by Arxiates to cast himself on the generosity of the great conqueror, a quality of which he had himself a very satisfactory experience. Corines therefore surrendered, and was rewarded by being confirmed in his government. Alexander after this success proceeded to Bactria in order to make preparation for his expedition into India, but left Crateros to reduce such of the tribes as still held out for independence. At Bactria another tragedy was enacted. The court pages, at the instigation of one of their number, called Hermolaus, who had been subjected to some degrading punishment, conspired against the king, who narrowly escaped assassination. The pages, who all belonged to families of high rank, were tortured to extract confessions of their guilt, and were then stoned to death by the Macedonians. The confessions indicated, it is said, that Callisthenes, a literary man attached to the court who had been permitted, on the recommendation of his kinsman Aristotle, to accompany the expedition, not only knew of the existence of the plot, but had encouraged the pages to persist in their design. He had rendered himself obnoxious to the king by the freedom with which he expressed his opinions and by his opposition to the Persian fashions introduced into the court, and his doom was sealed. Accounts differ as to the time and mode of his death. According to Ptolemy, he was tortured and then crucified, but Aristobulus and Chares agree in stating that he was carried about in chains and died at last of disease in India. The summer had set in when Alexander set out from Bactra on his Indian expedition. He crossed the chain of Paropamizos in 10 days, and halted at the Alexandria which he had founded at their base to settle the affairs of that city and the surrounding district. The narrative of his campaigns, from the time he left this place till he led his army into Carmania, after its disastrous march through the burning sands of the Gedrosian desert, is given in full detail in the translations which form the body of this work. His march, which on his emerging from the desert lay through the beautiful and fertile province of Carmania, resembled a festive procession, and the license in which he permitted his soldiers to indulge was meant no less to obliterate the memory of their terrible sufferings in the desert than to celebrate according to Bacchic fashion and example the conquest of India. In Carmania, Alexander received intelligence that Philip, who had been left in command of all the country west of the Indus, had been slain in a mutiny by the Greek mercenaries under his command, but that the Macedonian troops had quelled the mutiny and put the assassins to death. He did not at the time appoint any successor to Philip, but empowered Eudemos and Taxiles to take temporary charge of the affairs of the satrapy. Before he left Carmania he was rejoined by Crateros, who brought in safety the division of the army which he had led from the Indus by way of Arachosia, Drangiana, and the Carmanian desert. Nikos also visited his camp, which at the time was a 5 days' journey distant from the sea, and communicated the welcome news that the fleet had arrived in safety at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. The admiral was instructed to continue the voyage by sailing up the Gulf to the mouth of the Tigris, while Hephaestion was put in command of the main army with orders to proceed to Susa along the maritime parts of Persis and Susiana. The king himself with a small division took the upper road which led to that capital through Pasargadae and Persepolis. In Persis things had not gone well in his absence. The satrap whom he had appointed was dead, and his office had been usurped by Auxines, a Persian of great wealth and high rank, against whom many acts of violence and oppression were charged. He found also that the tomb of Cyrus had been desecrated and plundered, and this outrage excited his violent indignation, since he looked upon that conqueror as the founder of the vast empire which was now his own. He could not discover the perpetrators, but had to content himself with ordering the violated sepulchre to be properly restored. On reaching Persepolis he investigated the charges against Auxines, and finding them proved, put him to death, and gave his satrapy to Peucestes, one of the commanders of his bodyguard. In Persis the health of Kalanos, the Indian gymnosophist, who, at Alexander's request, had abjured the ascetic life and followed him from India, began to fail, and, as he chose rather to die than suffer the infirmities of age, he announced that it was his intention to burn himself. The king attempted to dissuade him, but finding that he was inexorably bent on self-destruction, ordered a funeral pyre to be prepared for him, and all the arrangements connected with his cremation to be superintended by Ptolemy. On the day appointed the devotee ascended the pyre and perished in its flames, exhibiting throughout a serene fortitude and self-possession which greatly astonished the Macedonians who attended in throngs to witness this strange spectacle. Strabo makes Pasargadae to be the scene of this incident, but Diodoros, Susa, and with more probability, since we know that Nikos was an eyewitness of the burning. Alexander reached Susa in the beginning of the year 324 BC, and remained there for a considerable time, regulating the affairs of his new dominions. One of his great objects was to fuse together as far as was practicable his European with his Asiatic subjects, and to this end he assigned to some 80 of his generals Asiatic wives, giving with each an ample dowry. He took himself a second wife, Barsine, called sometimes Statae, the eldest daughter of Darius, and, it is said, also a third, Parysatis, the daughter of Ochos, one of the predecessors of Darius. About 10,000 Macedonians followed the example of their superiors, and all who did so received presents from their royal master. Carrying out this object in another form, he enrolled a large number of Asiatics among his European troops. These new schemes were so bitterly resented by the better class of his Macedonian veterans that they rose against him in a mutiny which he had no little difficulty in quelling. About 10,000 of these veterans were dismissed, and they returned to Europe under the command of Crateros. Towards the close of the year he went to Ecbatana, and there he lost his chief favorite Hephaestion, who succumbed to an attack of fever. His grief at this bereavement knew no bounds, and showed itself in acts which seem copied from those wherewith Achilles demonstrated his passionate sense of the loss of his beloved Patroclus. From Ecbatana he marched back towards Babylon, and was met on the way by ambassadors from all parts of the known world, who came to do homage to the greatest of all kings and conquerors, and also by a deputation of Chaldean priests who warned him of danger if at that time he should enter Babylon. He entered it nevertheless, though with gloomy forebodings, early in the spring of 323 BC. As this city was the best point of communication between the eastern and western parts of his dominions, he had selected it to be the capital of his vast empire, and accordingly took measures immediately on his return for the improvement of its internal condition, for the drainage of the swampy lands in its neighborhood which rendered its climate unhealthy, and also for removing obstacles to the safe and easy navigation of the great river by which it communicated with the sea. His ambition being still, however, unsated, he meditated fresh conquests, which, if effected, would have made him master of the world from the shores of the Atlantic to the Eastern Ocean. But his end was now drawing near. The climate of Babylon was malarious, and as his spirits were depressed both by his loss of Hephaestion and by superstitious fears, he was less able to withstand its malignant influences. He caught a fever, and having aggravated its virulence by indulging in convivial excesses, was cut off in June 323 BC at the age of 33, and after he had reigned for nearly 13 years. So passed from the earth, says Bishop Thirlwall, one of the greatest of her sons, great above most for what he was in himself, and not, as many who have borne the title, for what was given him to effect. Great, not merely in the vast compass and the persevering ardor of his ambition, but in the course which his ambition took, in the collateral aims which ennobled and purified it, so that it almost grew into one with the highest of which man is capable, the desire of knowledge and the love of good. In a word, great as one of the benefactors of his kind. It may be truly asserted that his was the first of the great monarchies founded in Asia that opened a prospect of progressive improvement, and not of continual degradation, to its subjects. It was the first that contained any element of moral and intellectual progress. This estimate, high as it is, appears to be just and sober, and to hold a due balance between the extravagant eulogiums and the damnatory criticisms of other writers such as Mitford, Williams, and Droysen on the one hand, and Nebu, St. Croix, and Grote on the other, who all alike allowed their ethical and political proclivities to bias their judgment. Alexander was dignified both in his appearance and in his demeanor. He was not above the ordinary height, but his frame was well built and extremely muscular. He was very handsome in person, says Arrian, devoted to exertion, of an active mind and a most heroic courage, tenacious of honor, ever ready to meet dangers, indifferent to the pleasures of the body, and strictly observant of his religious duties. Plutarch tells us that the statues of Alexander which most resembled him were those of Lysippos, who alone had his permission to represent him in marble, and who best hit off the turn of his head, which leaned a little to one side. He adds that he was of a fair complexion, with a tinge of red in his face and upon his breast, and that his breath and whole person were so fragrant that they perfumed his undergarments. In another passage, describing Alexander's habits, the same author says that he was very temperate in eating, and that he was not so much addicted to wine as he was thought to be. What gave rise to this opinion was his practice of spending a great deal of time at table. The time, however, was passed rather in talking than drinking, every cup introducing some long discussion. Besides, he never sat long at table except when he had abundance of leisure. There was always a magnificence at his table, and the expense rose with his fortune till it came to the fixed sum of 10,000 drams for each entertainment. As in his dying moments he had given orders that his body should be conveyed to Ammon in the Libyan oasis, it was embalmed, and after more than 2 years had been spent in making preparations for its removal, it was conveyed with vast pomp in a car of wondrous magnificence to Egypt, where it was entombed first at Memphis, and afterwards, by the authority of Ptolemy, at Alexandria, the greatest of all the cities which he had founded and called after his name. Alexander was so prematurely cut off, and was besides so much occupied before his death with organizing fresh expeditions, both maritime and military, that he had no time to improve or complete the measures which he had initiated for promoting the fusion and securing the permanent unification of the multifarious races comprised in his empire. Had he been vouchsafed a longer term of life, it seems probable that he would have succeeded in welding so firmly together all the parts of his dominions that centuries might have elapsed before they became again disintegrated. But the dissensions which speedily broke out between his great captains, originating in their ambition to rule with independent authority, shattered his empire and embroiled it in wars which lasted for nearly half a century. Soon after his death, Perdiccas, to whom in his last moments he had given his signet ring, was appointed to conduct the government on behalf of the royal family, which was held to consist of Aridaeus, the king's half-brother, a man of weak intellect and character, and Queen Roxana, who a few months after her husband's death gave birth to a son who received the name of Alexander Agos. The satrapies were then divided among the leading generals. Perdiccas soon began to use his position for the furtherance of his own selfish designs, and having secured the support of Eumenes, attempted to crush his colleagues and assume all power to himself. He marched first into Egypt against Ptolemy, but on the banks of the Nile he was defeated and slain in a mutiny of his own men. 321 BC. Tidings soon afterwards reached the army that Craterus had been defeated and slain in fighting against Eumenes while marching to assist Ptolemy. The office of regent was upon this offered to Ptolemy, who declined its acceptance, as he held that the satrapies should become independent kingdoms. The army then conferred that office, along with the tutelage of the royal family, on Antipater of Macedonia, who had crossed over into Asia to oppose Perdiccas. A new partition of the provinces, which did not differ much from the former, was then made at a place in Upper Syria called Triparadisos. Under this arrangement Ptolemy held Egypt, Lysimachos, Thrace, Antigonos, Phrygia or Central Asia Minor, Seleucos, Babylon, Antigenes, Susiana, Peucestas, Persia, Pathan, son of Craterus, Media, Nikos, Pamphylia and Lycia, Aridaeus, Hellespontine Phrygia, Antipater and Polysperchon, Macedonia and Greece. Eumenes still held the satrapy at first assigned to him, that of Cappadocia, Paphlagonia, and Pontos, and was now the leader of those who had been the adherents of Perdiccas. He was supported by Alcetas, the brother of Perdiccas, Peucestas, Attilos, Antigenes, and by the influence of Olympias, the mother of Alexander. Besides Perdiccas and Craterus, two other great generals had by this time disappeared from the scene, Meleager, who had been cut off by Perdiccas, and Leonatos, who had been slain in the Lamian War. Antigonos was appointed by Antipater to conduct the war against Eumenes, and after many fluctuations of fortune at last captured him and put him to death. This happened early in the year 316 BC. The fortunes of Alexander's empire were then left at the disposal of 5 men, Antigonos, Lysimachos, Ptolemy, Seleucos, and Cassander, the son of Antipater, who had died in the year 319 BC. The ambition and ever-increasing power of Antigonos soon led his colleagues to form a coalition against him, and a long series of hostilities followed. In the end Antigonos and his son Demetrios, surnamed Poliorcetes, were defeated by the Confederates in the Battle of Ipsos in 301 BC. Antigonos fell on the field of battle, and the greater part of his dominions fell to the share of Seleucos, whose cavalry and elephants had been chiefly instrumental in winning the victory. He received as his reward a great part of Asia Minor as well as the whole of Syria from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean. Ptolemy obtained Phoenicia and Hollow Syria, but these provinces afterwards gave rise to frequent wars between succeeding kings of Egypt and Syria. A war in later times broke out between Seleucos and Lysimachos, in which the latter was slain in 281 BC. His kingdom of Thrace was afterwards merged in that of Macedonia. Thus the empire of Alexander, after a period of incessant wars continued for upwards of 40 years, was divided between the powerful monarchs of Macedonia, Egypt, and Syria. The successors of Seleucos were unable to retain hold of their remote eastern dependencies. About the middle of the 3rd century BC Theodotos or Diodotos, the governor of Bactra, revolted from his grandson Antiochos II, and made Bactra an independent kingdom. Not long afterwards Asoka, the grandson of Chandragupta, as we learn from one of his own inscriptions, sent missionaries to the kings of the West to proclaim to them and to their subjects the doctrines of Buddhism. The kings named in the inscription are Antiochus II, king of Syria, Turamiah, Ptolemy III, Euergetes, king of Egypt, Antigona, Antigonas Gonatas, king of Macedonia, Magas, king of Cyrene. About the year 212 BC, Antiochus III, surnamed the Great, marched eastward to recover Parthia and Bactria, which had both revolted from the second Antiochus. He was, however, unable, even after a war which lasted for some years, to effect the subjugation of these kingdoms, and accordingly concluded a treaty with them in which he recognized their independence. With the assistance of the Bactrian sovereign Euthydemus, who founded the greatness of the Bactrian monarchy, he made an expedition into India, where he renewed the alliance with that country which had been formed in the days of Sandracotos. From Sarphagasinos, the chief of the Indian kings, he obtained a large supply of elephants, and then returned to Syria by the route through Arachosia in the year 205 BC.